Welcome, everyone. Nice to see all the introductions in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. We're really delighted to have you all with us today. My name is Mila Boyer. I'm with Reos Partners, and together with my colleague Lisa Rudnick, I'm going to be the host for today's session. This webinar is actually the final event in a series of convenings around disinformation that were held over the past 3 or 4 months. Convened by Oak and CIFF foundations, and with the participation of over 80 thought leaders, implementers, and funders actively working in this space. So it's been a very rich conversation, but we've designed the webinar here today not to talk about what we've done and what you missed if you weren't there, or to be repetitive for those of you who were, but really to be content focused and forward looking and strategic, building on what was discussed during the convening series, but not necessarily going through the steps that were followed or repeating what was already covered. So looking forward to sharing some of our most potent ideas with you today, and to a great lineup of speakers. I'll just go through the agenda for the session. So right now what we're doing is the welcome and framing. Then we'll just share a high-level introduction to what we mean by a systemic approach to disinformation. We'll then explore 3 key leverage areas with 3 of our speakers who participated in the series, and we'll introduce what those 3 leverage areas are. And then we'll have 2 of our funders speaking to the implications for funders, and finally some next steps. The chat will be open throughout the session, so feel free to comment, to share resources, and to engage with each other in the chat. Other than that, it's not a highly interactive session. We have a dynamic group of speakers for you, but it's not as interactive as the co-creative sessions that we did during the convenings. We do also have a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you click there, you can actually pose questions to the speakers using that function. We most likely won't have time for an actual Q&A session at the end. But we will gather the questions. If we do have time, we'll cover a few of them, and otherwise we'll respond to some of them in writing as part of the follow-up communication. Just to acknowledge as well that this webinar, of course, is happening against the backdrop of an evolving war in Ukraine, and other conflicts also still ongoing, Ethiopia and Syria and elsewhere, where disinformation is playing a very central role. So I think disinformation is very much on our minds in relation to those conflicts. The conflict and the war in Ukraine is not the central focus of today's session, but it's very much on our minds, as it is probably on yours. And it certainly brings an urgency to this conversation. What I'd like to do next is just to invite Matt and Medina, Matt Gould from CIFF and Medina Hayri from the Oak Foundation, to share from their 2 perspectives just their motivation in hosting and initiating this convening. So over to you, Matt and Medina.
Hi, everyone. I've been nominated to go first, so I will start, and Matt can join me. I just want to quickly thank everyone that participated in these convenings. I think we can all agree that we had some really rich discussions and generated a lot of learning. Oak Foundation and CIFF are funders that are active in a range of issues, including gender justice, climate, public health, human rights, that are really affected by the disinformation that is being, sent out into the world. And we have seen firsthand the harm that is done to the communities and the organizations and the movements that we support. And so we are eager, and the reason why we supported this series is that we're eager to think about systemic strategies for addressing these challenges. I think I can say that we have heard a lot. We're going to go back and reflect on what we've learned and work in tandem with other funders, thought leaders, and implementers to think about our respective grant-making strategies moving forward. We've also heard feedback from the participants about how to build those strategies, and we will also take that feedback to heart as we think about ways to address this work in partnership with many others. I just want to give a special shout out to Mila, Lisa, and Sydney for their leadership in curating and facilitating these sessions. We really appreciated working in partnership with them and have really appreciated all of their efforts. So I will pass it to Matt.
Thanks, Medina. I don't really have anything else massive to add to that. Just a massive thank you to everyone that's taken part in this, in all the sessions. I know it hasn't been an insubstantial amount of time that's been needed, so thank you for taking that time out of your days. I obviously can't speak for anyone other than CIFF, but it's been really helpful in helping us think through this type of work and how we can kind of go about funding it in a different way, hopefully in a better way. And we come across a lot of partners on this call that we're keen to keep speaking with. I'm sure that's the case for other funders as well. I hope for the people on the doing side, the implementers and the thought leaders, I'd hope it's been useful for you as well, either in making connections to other people that are doing brilliant work that you might be able to collaborate with, maybe on meeting a few other funders who may be interested in speaking with you further as well. And I'm sure there's lots of stuff that will hopefully come off the back of this. So thank you very much to everyone for taking the time to be such brilliant partners in all of this.
Great, thank you both. And thank you for initiating this. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen again and offer a high-level introduction, as mentioned, to what we mean by a systemic approach to disinformation. So disinformation is a systemic problem, and it requires a systemic approach. You know, we need to address it with a systemic approach. In our work when we work in Reos Partners with complex systemic problems, we find the metaphor of an iceberg quite helpful in thinking about the sort of multiple levels of such a situation and mapping problematic situations. So if we think about an iceberg, the reason why it's a good metaphor is because there are some things that are visible above the surface, and what's visible above the surface is really highly affected by what's under the surface, the underlying currents and the underlying structures of the iceberg. So when we think about disinformation, above the surface, there are events. These are our newspaper headlines, the events, the observable events that happen and that we experience, you know, in our daily work and lives. When those events happen over time and over space, we start to see patterns that are emerging and that we can respond to. When we respond at the level of events, what we're really doing is firefighting. This is very important in terms of responding directly to harm that's being caused and to problems that are emerging. And in the disinformation space, what this sometimes looks like is fact-checking, counter-messaging, debunking, rumor checking, and so on. It's really important work. At the same time, these events and patterns are kept in place and continually fueled by some underlying structures and mindsets. When we talk about structures, we're talking about basically the rules of the game, the formal and informal rules of the game, the written and unwritten rules. So both policies, regulations, but also power structures, norms, and institutions, essentially. Those structures are also kept in place by some mindsets, some ways of thinking, paradigms, beliefs, assumptions that create the conditions for those structures to remain in place. When we respond at the level of structures and mindsets, we're really working on systemic change. And in the work of some of the work around disinformation, for example, when we're addressing structures, we're looking at financial incentives or regulation and policy and so on. And some of the mindsets that came up in the disinformation convening as problematic, and of course there are many, but for example, that responding to disinformation or whether to believe disinformation, whether to share disinformation is an individual responsibility. And also a mindset, for example, that truth will prevail over lies. So we just need to give more correct information, more truthful information, and that will prevail. These are just a couple of the mindsets that are present in this system as examples. We need both firefighting and systemic change. So this is not to say that we should be doing systemic change instead of firefighting. I think it's perfectly understandable, especially in the current situation, that a lot of our attention right now is on emergency. It's on directly responding to harm. And addressing drivers alone does little to protect individuals and societies exposed to the harmful impacts with potentially devastating consequences, in the now. At the same time, fighting fires alone leaves the roots of the problem to grow and evolve, and essentially the problem continues to manifest. In the disinformation convenings, we looked, this is clearly a multidimensional problem, and we looked at it from different dimensions, through different lenses. These 5 lenses were applied. We mapped the events, patterns, structures, and mental models from each of these perspectives. And then through that work, looked at some underlying leverage areas that are more at the bottom of the iceberg, and that therefore have an impact on what happens on the surface. And we'll share those leverage areas shortly. What we mean by leverage areas is that they're consequential issues or concerns where influence or change can help shift the problematic dynamics in a complex system. When we talk about low leverage, we mean that a small amount of effort will lead to a small change. And when we talk about something being high leverage, we mean that a relatively small amount of force can lead to a large change. And as mentioned in the iceberg, if you try and push an iceberg from the surface, you're not going to get very far. It's really the underlying currents and the underlying structures of the iceberg. So the higher leverage tends to be at the bottom of the iceberg, at the structures and mental models, even if that's more difficult to address, especially with limited resources. Okay, and then just finally, one more notion here is this notion that there's a collaboration gap. So by collaboration gap, we mean the difference that enhanced collaboration or a more networked response would make between our current success and our potential success in countering disinformation. So this is not to say that we have to collaborate on everything or that we should collaborate for collaboration's sake. It's really saying that there are some places and some strategies where collaboration will make us more effective in countering disinformation. There are sometimes that autonomous action is more effective, and especially sometimes when we're firefighting or responding in emergencies, we just don't have time for collaboration, and that's perfectly understandable. We need to be discerning about when is collaboration going to be more effective and when is autonomous action more effective, but also how do we enable collaboration to be easier, less costly, more accessible. And so really looking at what are the obstacles to collaboration and also what are the enablers to collaboration so that it becomes an easier choice to make. And so in the convening series, we also looked at what are some of the collaborative opportunities and how do we enable more effective collaboration to counter disinformation. And I think a very important point here that was made in the convenings was that when we're mapping such complex systems and identifying a series of leverage areas, there's no silver bullet. So we have to work on multiple leverage areas at the same time, but that doesn't mean that everyone has to do everything. You need to, each organization or each alliance, each actor needs to be clear on what their part of, of the place that they intervene, their part of the contribution is, and then complement that with the work of others and identify those strategic collaborations. So we can work at a systemic level together, and that doesn't mean that everyone has to do everything. Okay, with that, I'm gonna hand over to Lisa to introduce the 5 leverage areas that were identified in the convenings and our 3 speakers who are going to speak to 3 of those areas. Over to you, Lisa.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mille, very much. So as Mille just mentioned, countering disinformation effectively requires both fighting fires and addressing systemic drivers. And in this series, participants identified 5 leverage areas, though certainly there are more to be discovered, but that we can work on to do just that. And today we're going to touch upon 3 of them. We've invited these three participants to reflect on the following questions. The first one was, why is this a high leverage area for addressing the disinformation ecosystem? How will shifting this area change the game? And if we're going to make the most of this leverage area, what do we need to do now, either individually as our own organizations or collectively together across sectors and silos? So the first leverage area that we're going to look at is financial and commercial incentives. This leverage area captures several strong themes and issues. One that emerged around the business models animating social media companies that incentivize technology, products, services, and practices that privilege profit over people and that foster the spread of disinformation throughout information ecosystems. But this leverage area also pertains not only to the attention economy, but also encompasses the role of advertisements and legacy media and incentives to platform users to create opportunities to monetize information in this poorly regulated space. So the core question that this leverage area invites us to ask is, how can we shift or influence the financial and commercial incentives of the disinformation and information economy? So speaking to this leverage today, we're very fortunate to have Sarah Murphy. She's the CEO of Shareholder Commons. Her rich background includes work in international development and disaster response fields, research for the Investor Responsibility Research Center, specializing in bioengineering and defense contracting research, work in environmental consultancy, and also work as a senior sustainability analyst. So, Sarah, why are financial and commercial incentives a high leverage area for addressing the problems and challenges we're facing with disinformation?
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks for the spontaneous promotion. I'm actually the Chief Strategy Officer at my organization. And please, everyone, excuse my scratchy voice. I hope that I am adequately audible. So the core problem is that disinformation sells, appealing to and exacerbating people's fears and anxieties by peddling inaccurate, decontextualized, exaggerated, or misleading information can be highly profitable. Under our prevailing business and investment model that compels corporate boards to favor profits above all other priorities, a shift to information sources grounded in principles of journalistic integrity is fundamentally disincentivized and inhibited. People around the world are falling prey to messaging in the news and on social media that inflames ethnic tensions, degrades public health efforts, and destabilizes democratic institutions. When viral messaging on social media platforms tells us humans bear no responsibility for climate change, COVID-19 is a hoax, and the invasion of Ukraine is a campaign to liberate free citizens from Nazis, this is not a bug in the system, it's a feature. Last October, Frances Haugen, a former Facebook's data scientist, testified before the US Senate. She said, quote, "I'm here today because I believe Facebook's products harm children, stoke division, and weaken our democracy. The company's leadership knows how to make Facebook and Instagram safer, but won't make the necessary changes because they put their astronomical profits before people," end quote. So in a nutshell, Haugen described the problems that arise from shareholder primacy, the idea that businesses owe their chief loyalty to shareholders. The doctrine fulfills two important roles. First, it encourages equity investment, which provides the high-risk first loss capital upon which a dynamic economy depends. Second, it facilitates the profit-seeking that a market economy uses to price inputs and outputs, thereby efficiently allocating resources. The current manifestation of shareholder primacy is failing on both accounts and is driving many business decisions that misallocate resources and harm shareholders in the long run. The misapplication of shareholder primacy hurts not only shareholders, but also anyone who depends on an efficient, innovative, and fair economy. It also threatens the critical resources upon which all of us rely. So the flaw in the current practice of shareholder primacy is the assumption that shareholders' interests are best served by using the financial returns of a company as the sole measure of its success. This inevitably encourages conduct that creates cost for the rest of the economy. At the same time, it undervalues investments that create positive spillover effects for other companies and the economy at large. The assumption that investors automatically benefit when companies increase their own value ignores two critical facts. One, most investors are diversified so that their investment returns depend largely upon overall market returns, which we call beta, rather than the relative returns of individual companies, known as alpha. And two, a company can improve its alpha with decisions that drag down beta. As a result, the current version of shareholder primacy works against most shareholders by creating a less efficient economy and a consequently lower beta. A properly conceived shareholder primacy model would recognize that diversified shareholders' interests extend far beyond individual company financial success, and that shareholders do best when companies compete and innovate without creating economic damage or shunning investments with positive spillover effects. And yet, investors around the world cling stubbornly to the company first model that allows companies such as Facebook to profit from advertising models that encourage sensational and inflammatory content with grave consequences and costs to society and the environment. If we have any hope of countering disinformation, we must develop accountability systems that align free market forces with human and ecological needs. We must challenge the status quo relationship between investors, capital markets, and sustainability. By shifting investors away from a company-first investment model that drives profit maximization at the company level to a systems-first investment approach that prioritizes value creation across a portfolio and the economy at large, we can create a level playing field for sustainable competition on which all companies can operate and people and planet can thrive. This will be achieved when investors act collectively to define and enforce societal and ecological boundaries through guardrails to which all companies must adhere. These guardrails will ensure that shareholders prosper financially by preserving common goods, such as quality jobs, lives with dignity, and healthy ecosystems. We can realize this goal by taking a systemic approach that targets 3 areas of influence on our financial markets. Shareholder stewardship, where we engage directly with investors around the globe to promote corporate behavior that protects social and environmental systems. Policy and litigation, to change the rules that govern investors in support of this more sustainable approach. And public advocacy and field building, where we catalyze the development of infrastructure that will be needed to inform, uphold, and reinforce this systems first approach over time. One stewardship tool available to shareholders is the shareholder proposal, wherein investors ask companies to undertake some sort of action, often on environmental, social, or governance matters. Most shareholder proposals center on financial materiality, or how a company's impact on society and the environment will affect its financial returns. This outside-in connection between impact and financial return often appeals to companies' desire to protect their brand and reputation and to avoid regulatory action. But those risks haven't been nearly enough to produce an adequate corporate response. Consider the irony that in the face of so much public scrutiny and controversy, Facebook's biggest recent moves have been to change its name and significantly expand the size and clout of its PR team. We filed shareholder proposals at Meta Platforms, new name, and other traditional and social media companies, asking them to disclose the costs they externalize and how those costs affect their diversified shareholders' portfolios. The target of these proposals is not so much the companies themselves, but rather the investors in those companies who failed to account for the bad trade they're making when they incentivize corporate behavior that damages critical systems. On the litigation front, we're about to file a lawsuit at a certain corporate culprit in the disinformation landscape. The suit will say that the company's board breached its fiduciary duties by failing to consider the wealth of company shareholders, instead considering only company share value. The company will likely move to dismiss the complaint by asserting that its directors have no duty to consider matters external to the return shareholders receive directly. If the court dismisses the claim, we'll have evidence that corporate law is one giant market failure, which will enable all of us, everyone on this call today, to push for policy change. If the court accepts the claim, then we will set a new precedent on fiduciary duty that will provide activists new grounds on which to challenge companies' damaging activities. On field building, we must continue to challenge the idea that corporate profit maximization equates to value maximization. While this work to change the financial markets won't be sufficient on its own to cure the disinformation problem, it is nevertheless essential. Without it, all other efforts will be swimming upstream. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for that compelling and to many of us, I think, a new approach. Okay, so the next leverage area that we're going to speak about is research, systemic learning, and the application gap. Now, for those of you who did participate in the series, Dr. Claire Wardle observed in the beginning at Convening Session 1 that the field of disinformation studies is both very new and it's also rapidly evolving. And so are the technologies and tactics and broader dynamics implicated by disinformation themselves. So the leverage area, this leverage area takes up the importance of improving sustained opportunities for deep and rigorous empirical research that helps us understand the dynamics that are unfolding and evolving, elevating the level of discussion about disinformation across different stakeholder groups through research, and improving the awareness, understanding, and skills of those involved in response, and finally addressing the existing application gap. So what we mean by that is the gap around processes for employing knowledge resources to inform and improve approaches and responses to emergent events and challenges. So this is connecting all of the pieces, all of the levels of the iceberg. So the primary question that we pose from the vantage point of this leverage area is, how can we develop spaces, infrastructures, and capacities for systemic learning about disinformation while still enabling and connecting to the needed short-term tactical actions? Speaking to this leverage area today is Fernando Bermejo. Fernando is a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. He's research director of Media Cloud, and he's also associate professor at the IE University in Madrid. His research focuses on media representation and on the different forms of measuring the internet, so people, content, infrastructure, and activity. He's also interested in the evolution of different forms of online advertising and on the processes of commercialization of interactivity. Now, Fernando, this is a complex leverage area as we've developed it here, because it encompasses both the research as well as better application and mobilization of research as key leverage points for helping to shift the disinformation ecosystem. So why is this a high leverage area?
Well, first of all, Lisa, thank you for inviting me to be part of this session and inviting me to be part of this series of seminars and discussions. And thank you for thank you to Oak and CIFF for supporting this, and to all the participants from which I've learned quite a bit as I have been participating in these sessions. But let me try to answer your question. Why is this important? In the interest of time, I actually thought of answering that question with a line from a song that says, "If you don't use your brain, someone will use it for you." But to be, or maybe just simply to say that research is the nemesis of disinformation, and there are two opposite phenomena, I would say. But just to elaborate a bit on that, when we encounter the world, when we face anything, any reality, we don't do it with a blank slate. We always come with assumptions and knowledge and theories. And we need those in order to function, in order to do what we want to do. Someone told me once that learning could be described as the process of crossing a room which is completely dark, and you have to find the exit door without knowing where it is. And if you just cross that room without touching anything, you successfully made it, but you did not learn anything. The only way that you learn something is by bumping into furniture and breaking glasses and lamps and stumbling upon chairs and tables. I see that as the role of research is the piece or of this puzzle that gives us that information, that contact with the world in which the world says, no, that's not the right way. So that's why I think it's important that we have research and learning. The way that this leverage area, I think, will change the game that we're facing is by giving us a proper understanding of the nature of the phenomena, which is, as Claire said, is complex and constantly evolving. But also, not just, I think we've become somewhat successful at describing how big it is or how problematic it is or how complex it is, but also we need to make progress in terms of how we understand its consequences and how we understand the ways of fighting it. And I think research is essential if we want to do that. In terms of the area of research, I would like to somehow go back to some of the discussions that we've had over the past few months. One of the things that has been put on the table, which I find very relevant, is the need for infrastructure, for research infrastructure. And that means the creation of a solid base that enables research, specific instances of research. And that can be in terms of repositories, it can be in terms of sharing methodologies, it can be in terms of journals and ways of sharing knowledge, it can be in terms of methods and techniques, it can be in terms of research centers. We need to create that research infrastructure that will enable researchers to do their job and help those who are doing the firefighting. A second thing that besides infrastructure has been requested, I would say, in these sessions is the need for cooperation. And when we talk about cooperation, it can obviously function in many different dimensions. But one very obvious, I would say, is the cooperation across disciplines. I have a background in communication research, and yet I spend most of my time over the past few years when dealing with mis and disinformation, talking to computer scientists and talking to lawyers and talking to anthropologists and talking to psychologists, and all the disciplines as have to deal with this phenomenon, have to collaborate, have somehow to find ways of talking to each other to address the phenomenon. That also applies for methods, not only disciplines. It's the idea that we cannot understand this just by looking at big quantitative data. We cannot understand it either just by doing ethnographic qualitative research. There has to be some kind of collaboration across disciplines, across methods, that would let us understand how to deal with disinformation and how to fight it. There is an additional dimension, I would say, about this cooperation, which I think is very important, and I think we're going to be talking more about that today, but I would love to nonetheless mention it, is the need to make this collaboration, this cooperation, as global as possible. When we're talking about mis and disinformation, we're talking about phenomena that have to do with language, that have to do with culture, that have to do with meaning making, with narratives. Those things are totally contextual. They're dependent on the culture, the language. We cannot keep on doing research about mis and disinformation in English only or in the West only. We have to figure out ways of being more global in the scope, the methods, the tools. And just to mention a small example about this, when working with natural language processing tools, which is common in this field, the moment you start using tools that are not in English, you start having limitations. There are tools that are not developed for other languages. And that's just like a small parcel or territory within this wide landscape of research that points to the need to be much more global, much more inclusive, much more need of cooperation. There's a final point which I would love to make, and has to do with what Lisa described as the application gaps. And it's this feeling that research, which is trying to understand the deep side of the iceberg, which is trying to understand the mental models, the systemic forces, the patterns, is somehow disconnected from the actual people who are acting, who are firefighting, who are trying to diminish the problem. And I think we definitely need to close that gap. We need to close that distance between the research and the use of the research. And that requires probably a lot of translation in terms of trying to connect the things that we're doing on the research side with the things that are happening on the implementer side. And I think it requires a lot of reduction of complexity. And in order to do that, it's an issue of practicality. So when people are doing their daily jobs, you cannot expect anyone to be reading 20 academic journals a month and following the proceedings of 5 conferences. That's not possible. We need to build mechanisms for reducing the complexity of research, the different trends, the different findings, the different data sources, to something that is immediately usable and applicable for those people who are on the front lines. Just to finish here, and mentioning about the sense of urgency to this field, as we're seeing traditional armies fighting for land and territory. There are also armies that we've seen that are fighting for our mental territory. And I think we cannot win that fight unless we have the right research, systemic learning, and we close that application gap. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fernando. You had a lot of ground to cover there, and you did it admirably. For our final leverage area, we're speaking to the role and voice of local communities. This leverage area considers the constrained role and voice. This leverage area considers the constrained role and voice of affected and marginalized communities in framing problems and developing solutions to disinformation. Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties here. Okay. Developing solutions to disinformation that arose in different ways across comments and discussions that related to convening session 1. This leverage area encompasses challenges related to top-down approaches to disinformation. So when there's much to learn from affected communities, the listening or learning isn't taking place. The dominance of Northern voices in developing many of the tools and methods and approaches that Fernando was just talking about, defining problems and also solutions, and a need for rights-based approaches and to address the marginalization of activists and communities in dialogue and decision-making around approaches to disinformation that affect them. The core question that we pose from this vantage point is, how can we ensure that local communities are involved in the prioritization of risk and harm, as well as other key decisions related to disinformation, and empowered to address disinformation in their own contexts? Speaking to this leverage area, we're lucky to have Nikem Agunya from Witness. Nikem is a project coordinator for Africa at Witness. Her focus is on countering the proliferation of manipulated media and mis and disinformation that undermines the trustworthiness of video evidence and that incites violence. She has almost a decade's experience working in both national and international organizations as a human rights activist, and she has engaged extensively on issues of freedom of expression, police brutality, democracy, and good governance, among other things. So Nikem, I'm going to turn the mic over to you and ask you, why is this a high leverage area? But in particular, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, if we're going to make the most of this leverage area, what do we really need to do now?
Thank you, Lisa, for the opportunity to share my experience working with communities on misinformation and disinformation. Before I start, I want to acknowledge what Fernando said about decentralizing language, which is a gap we have identified in the course of our work with communities. In 2019, Witness began an exceptionally deliberate effort towards engaging in conversations with stakeholders around misinformation and disinformation, but importantly, decentralizing the conversation from the global north, which has hitherto been the focus of this conversation. What did we find? We found that the realities of communities, such as connectivity, digital literacy, threats of surveillance, censorship, weaponization of data, and the lack of access to detection tools are not prioritized as they should in the global conversation. This has evolved to become what we have specifically focused on by working with communities to ensure that they are supported to push back against misinformation and disinformation within their context, while ensuring that the systems change reflects the needs of the communities that need it the most. It would be arrogance of us to assume that communities are not already designing, developing, and executing strategies that counter disinformation within their context. We must ensure that we do not fall into the rabbit hole where we decide what constitutes a threat, harms, and approaches to combating disinformation. This only breeds distrust and magnifies the impact of systemic inequalities. The challenge we're confronting is nuanced and contextual, and this is echoing Fernando's remarks, which indicates that a one-size-fits-all and quick fixes will not address the issue. There is a need for corresponding investment in cultural and structural change that prioritizes communities. A lot of the solutions that have been thrown at resolving misinformation and disinformation have been tech-focused. The communities we work with tell us that there is a need to prioritize non-tech methods in combating these threats. For example, in northern Nigeria, a region ravaged by Boko Haram insurgency for over a decade now, has left the civilian population vulnerable, not just to the violent attacks by the insurgents and the military, but their vulnerability extends to the information warfare on both sides. One of our partners from this region expressed frustration over the overwhelming insistence on technological methods in combating disinformation. In her words, I quote, "Technological solutions in combating misinformation and disinformation are good, but they must be supplementary and aligned with existing structures that are relevant to the community. In her context, there are trusted communication channels that are effective." She went on to explain how community verifiers are relied on by community members as custodians of truth. Relatedly, waterfront communities in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria constantly experience forced evictions by successive governments. These raids have led to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of women, men, and children. In some instances, this violent nature of these evictions has led to the death of many in these communities. What is most horrifying is that they are an invisible population that enjoy little to no sympathy from the larger society. This is largely due to government's disinformation campaign that profiled these communities as hideouts for criminals and a safety and hygiene threat to the larger society. To counter this, the community, led by young people, established a community radio station that tells their story of resilience in dignity. To become visible, they began mapping their communities, ensuring that they are visible on the map. Other communities in Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, amongst others, are turning to video to capture and preserve trusted, authentic accounts of human rights crimes while countering false narratives. In all that I have described, technology plays a huge role in confronting disinformation, but in ways that are relevant and iterative to suit the evolving needs of these communities. We can't have an honest conversation about the role and voice of communities without considering it within the context of power dynamics. We have to move away from interventions that only speak to our role as implementers, thought leaders, and funders working with and in communities to a holistic approach that centers communities and their role in creating change. How do we do this? Engagement is an option, but frankly, it is meaningless without representation. How can we, who are in many regards privileged, yield power and distribute agency to those who are most vulnerable to disinformation? As we facilitate the design, development, and distribution of truth infrastructures, how do we ensure that the voices of communities are represented? Local communities do not exist separate from global trends and technology. As we look at emerging technologies and strategies of misinformation and disinformation, we need to ensure that the threat prioritization and solutions are grounded in diverse, global, and grassroots community needs. For the last 3 decades, Witness has been helping communities advocating for human rights change to create trustworthy information, to protect themselves against the misuse of their content, and to challenge misinformation that targets at-risk groups and individuals. Recently, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, popularly known as C2PA, this might be familiar to a few of us, published its specification, making it possible for any tool or device to add features that track the source and history of digital media. If widely adopted, the specifications could lead towards a systematic use of provenance and authenticity infrastructure that is meant to tackle misinformation and disinformation and generate trust in digital media. Witness has influenced this and related initiatives at an early stage to empower critical voices globally and bolster a human rights framework. Our role as stakeholders in this ecosystem must be rooted in recognizing, respecting, and amplifying the role and voice of communities. It is unique that we have donor organizations in the room today. I have been a part of a broad range of convenings on confronting disinformation, and rarely do we have donor organizations play an active role in the conversation. It would be excellent to see more donor funding committed to centering and elevating the role and voices of communities and fostering collaboration among stakeholders in a sustainable manner. I must recognize that there are donors or donor organizations who are already thinking about this and committing funds towards it. If you are wondering if this is a good idea, yes, it is. Thank you.
Nikyam, thank you so much for that. And thanks for providing me with an excellent segue to our next segment. But also I want to thank all 3 of our speakers for unpacking these leverage areas. They're very dense. There's a lot to consider there, and for sharing your reflections both from the series and your own experiences, which really touch on the power and the potential that they represent for helping us attend to the larger drivers of this disinformation ecosystem. And now we're going to sort of shift our attention, having heard about these 3 leverage areas and the ways in which they create opportunities for different stakeholders to combine forces. We're now going to reflect on the way that this collaborative work that Nikyam just underscored, how it needs to take place across silos and across sectors and across subject areas. But this presents both challenges as well as opportunities for funders. And today we've invited 2 funders who participated in the series to reflect on some of those. So first we have Kevin Sheaves, who's joining us from he's the head of the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy. And Kevin oversees the forum's staff and research on authoritarian influence and sharp power, disinformation, emerging technology, and transnational kleptocracy. And then we have Jenny Toomey, who is joining us from the Ford Foundation. Jenny is the head of the International Program for Technology and Society at the Ford Foundation. And she works closely with the Office of the President on initiatives in the groundbreaking field of public interest technologies. So Kevin, starting with you, what are some of the implications for taking a systemic approach to disinformation for funders, and what are some of the things that NED is doing to respond to those?
Sure. Thanks so much, Lisa and Mille and others for having me. I'm excited to chat with you guys because we're sorting through these issues as well. And even just in preparation for this event, it was great to even just trade notes with Ginny and others on this issue, because I think the field of disinformation, malinformation, misinformation, however you define it in all of its forms, it's moving incredibly fast. And as all the speakers have mentioned, and especially Sarah, the amount of bad information in the system and the rate at which people are consuming it is pretty extraordinary. And I think funders in this space are pretty varied, and they have really accelerated a lot of their programs in this area, whether you're coming from the perspective of climate advocacy or democracy development like ours, to youth and children's education. Everyone sort of has a slice of disinformation in this issue and are trying to sort through what to do about it. My office, the National Forum, we sit at sort of this, as Fernando started to talk about, this translation of research into action, and we're essentially the research or part of the research arm of NED and its portfolio of grantees and really the broader democracy community. And we've really sorted through this problem and tried to approach this in a somewhat systematic manner, and really still have a lot of work to do. One of the trends that we found, and we did this through, we came to this realization through some research we commissioned not long ago. Lisa's going to put a summary of that research in the chat. And there were essentially 4 buckets of problems that civil society organizations who are involved in the counter disinformation battle highlighted. So the first is data access, and this is not a new problem, but we're talking about probably first and foremost access to platform data. Which is a very fundamental problem, and that the access to platforms, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, you name it, it's pretty varied. Some platforms are more forthcoming with their data with civil society researchers, and some aren't. And some have gone in fits and starts. The content moderation enterprises at these places are huge, but sometimes the access from third parties to those platforms are pretty different. And it's really a fundamental challenge, one that I'm pretty convinced that needs to be opened up a lot more, and not just in sort of fits and stages and incremental approaches to providing this organization more access and so forth, but it really needs to be a wholesale rethink in how platforms engage with those outside of their own companies. There's a pretty active debate on the concept of middleware, for example. But other data is actually really important and could be useful as well. We're talking about government data here. There's a lot of government funders in this space, and coming from government as a former State Department person, I understand the breadth of capabilities and data that governments have in this area to monitor the information space in different places. And those need to be shared with with grantees that they're funding and perhaps a wider community as well. There's also some really capable major research organizations out there who've done an incredible job building some of their own data sets, and those need to be really considered open source. And I think there's some initiatives in this area that are beginning to help elevate this problem. A second is training. One thing that our researchers found is that training, especially outside the United States and Europe, for advanced data research methods and statistical analysis and data visualization and all these things that are happening now in the counter disinformation field. When you go outside of America and Europe, you start to get, it's tougher, and there's not as much capacity there. We need to find ways to bring those capabilities to bear. One thing that I really appreciate what Niken mentioned from Witness is the importance of offline counter disinformation. And it's not just about sort of mining Twitter networks and mapping, the next Facebook bot network. It's also about finding different communities outside of the online space, whether it's religious communities or elsewhere that are continue to be peddlers of mis and disinformation. So how do we reach those communities is really important, and how do we communicate effectively to those places in ways that match the virality of disinformation and bad information? Third, another need is clearly flexible and longer term funding. I think this is especially acute in settings that are closed or authoritarian. You're seeing it now in Russia, you've seen it in the Philippines, you've seen it in some other places where these organizations who are at the front lines of countering disinformation, that they are receiving a lot of pressure themselves, whether that's litigation, whether that's physical threats, harassment, and the like, or trolling of their own true information in ways that sort of flood the information environment and make their messages, their truthful messages, unable to pierce. So I think that's something that's extremely important, one that we're taking seriously at NED as well. A fourth one, which Fernando began to talk about, is the importance of cross-border learning. I was really challenged at an event that NED hosted about 3 or 4 months ago with a pioneer in the human rights field. His name was Igor Blazevich, and he gave a challenge to civil society activists in the field to spend a quarter of their time outside of their own context, thinking outside of their own problems right in front of them in their country, and to think about learning from others that are out there. That's a big ask for organizations that are really busy and really overwhelmed from, especially in the disinformation field, but elsewhere in the field of democracy promotion. But it's one that's extremely important. This is a global problem, and the adversaries are oftentimes very networked, and I think increasingly networked. They learn from each other a lot. And there are now disinformation for hire firms that are out there where you can just simply pay for services in order to sort of spread a propagandist or false network online or elsewhere. And so the solutions really have to be networked. And to do that, we have to find ways to create space for these organizations to do this type of learning, to learn the latest of what's happening and what's working in Eastern Europe, and apply those lessons perhaps within the local context, of course, to Latin America or Africa or Asia. Those sort of linkages, they need to be created. And I think funders certainly sit at the cross-section of that. It's something that we're really focused on at NED. We have a whole portfolio of programs where it's specifically designed for this purpose, in order for organizations from one region or in one discipline to learn and implement practices in another one. A really good example is a program that the National Democratic Institute has called the Infotegrity Program. That's operating on a regional basis now in 2 or 3 places, and is being able to approach this problem in a pretty networked way that provides these sort of resource tools, provides data access, helps provide some of the training, helps provide some of the cross-border learning in ways that have really been the benefit of the results that they're seeing. Some implications for funders that we're thinking through, and it's something Lisa's going to put in chat. One more thing that I wrote about recently where I talked about this is I think that by and large, funders need to act more like venture capitalists and less like micromanagers or project managers. I think venture capitalists, when you think of them, they're often unafraid to fail. They think of their investments more as seed money or down payments and less as transactions that immediately pay a benefit. Whether they're funders from government, prominent foundations like Ford, who's here, or our own, we need to operate in the same ways. One thing that's also specific, I think, to the issue of counter disinformation is that it's difficult to measure the impact of what's working. It's even difficult to measure the impact of the disinformation itself. Sometimes it's even tougher to figure out if you're actually having the positive effect. So sometimes those payoffs can be iterative. Sometimes the payoff from your investment as a funder can come in the long term. I think micromanaging projects from afar in order to produce X outcome from Y program, it can lead to poor results. And to be frank, some distrust sometimes between funders and local organization. I talked earlier about the funding need to be long-term and flexible, but they need to be able to survive this pressure environment that a lot of organizations find themselves in closed or liberal settings, but also be able to sustain the long-term learning and staff build up, so that they can effectively do work, not just at the outset within a 6-month time frame, but really in the longer term. There's been some interest as well in discussions in this recent convening series about should we have some sort of collaboration, some sort of bigger network, some sort of formal systemized way to get at these problems that we're all talking about. And I think there was somewhat agreement on what the problems were. Some principles that I'm beginning to think of ways in which that can be done. One is I think coordination needs to happen at all levels. that if funders are getting together to talking about collaborating on programs or providing resources to their grantees down in the field, that it needs to be happening at the high level, at the head of organization level. It needs to be happening at the lower level as well. Second, those sort of collaborations need to be purpose-driven. The world is full is littered full of networks that have come and gone over the span of a year or two because they either took on too much of a mission or perhaps the wrong mission that wasn't right for the moment. So these sort of questions about purpose and mission and impact, they really have to be clear among all participants that are there. Third, I think one thing that's really important in this space is that funders need to think beyond their own portfolio of grantees and equipping not just them, but thinking about the whole field of this. The number of funders involved in this space, as I mentioned earlier, it's really grown exponentially over the last 3 or 4 years because the problems have. But some of these resources, we're talking about data access, training, curriculum, playbooks for dealing with electoral misinformation or whatever. These things need to be shared among really the global network of non-governmental organizations and responders. You can't just think about those in your portfolio because really they're grabbing funding from a lot of different places in some ways, and sometimes they may not be with you after a year or two for whatever reason. So they have to be trained up in these things. They have to be connected to some of the architecture of information and people that are out there. So the last thing I would say as a principle in thinking about this is that I think it needs to be fit for a global challenge. Fernando challenged us earlier on this point that you have to think about it not just as sort of what's happening in your own country, but really thinking about this globally. And it can't just be what's happening in the United States or Western Europe and places where there's so much data now on what's happening in the misinformation or in the information environment. And there's a really active and vibrant civil society of researchers, think tanks, private sector firms, content moderation operations, all thinking about this problem and working on it. You got to think about this globally. That's got to go beyond sort of the traditional advanced democracies. You got to think elsewhere because, in fact, I would argue that some of the political violence that's happened globally around this issue as a result of misinformation and disinformation and hate speech, that oftentimes it's actually more acute elsewhere outside the United States and Europe. So thank you very much. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Kevin. You've given us a lot of food for thought there. And now we're going to turn the mic over to Jenny. And Jenny, Ford has been in the tech environment, tech and information space for quite some time in terms of your programs and funding. But you've also been thinking a lot about how to meet the need of implementers that Kevin was just touching upon as well with regards to sustained funding and ways of incentivizing collaboration and the special demand for working in that way that the conditions of disinformation present. So from your experiences, I'm wondering, what do you see as some of the key implications for taking a systemic approach to disinformation for funders and also in this moment of the digital transition?
Wonderful, thanks. Thank you so much for asking me to be part of this convening. It's been really, really rich, and I can't emphasize how much I agree with the recommendations of the previous speakers. Almost every single one is an important intervention in trying to get more prepared to deal with this continuously morphing problem of disinformation and misinformation. The way I looked at the feedback we got from the first sessions, I see two buckets that I can talk about as a donor who's done this work for a long time. And I was lucky enough when I came to Ford 15 years ago to have a president, it was Luis Ubiñas back then, who let me make a case for working on internet rights at that moment. He said, oh, all those rules have already been established. And I said, no, none of those rules have been established. And we were able to make a case for it. And we did that work for a long time. And so a lot of the recommendations that I would have to other donors have come like through long hours of attempted solutions and collaborations with grantees and learning. And so, I understand that every foundation has its own journey, and foundations are successful and fail. And so I really don't want this to be in any way seem to be like we've got it figured out, but this is just some of the learning that we've experienced in the past 15 years that maybe can be helpful in thinking about how foundations would approach the systemic challenge of mis and disinformation. So the first bucket was a lot of feedback from the grantees and organizations that we work with about the approach of how our types of funding undermine their ability to be effective to respond to big challenges like this. And so with that, I would just say that is true in the misinformation space, and that's probably true in every space where we work. So I would just say that there are two learning areas that the foundation, Ford Foundation, has had. One is we did a big survey of all of our grantees when Darren Walker became president, asking how we could be a better foundation. And they took all of that criticism and feedback, and they made some big investments in trying to work in a different way. And again, with the caveat that there are probably things that Ford is doing right now that frustrate people. It's not that this is the silver bullet solution, but there has been a lot of learning, and it seems a shame to not share it. So one thing was that we needed larger general support grants, flexible grants, and investments in the capacity of resilience of our most important organizations. And so there was a program called BUILD, B-U-I-L-D. A woman named Kathy Wright is the director of BUILD. She managed it for the past, I think, 6 years. We did 5 years of funding. $1 billion went out to 300 organizations in 5-year grants that were general support, plus all of these other kinds of supports around developing their capacity. And there was a lot of learning that went into that, and it was successful. And so we're doing another build that's just starting this year. But Kathy is always happy to talk about what worked and what didn't work in relation to changing how we did our grant making, how we could hold longer grants, even while paying out the minimum amount we needed to in relation to our endowment. So there's a lot of learning there. The second thing that Ford invested in with 4 other foundations was something called the True Cost Initiative, which was admitting that 10% was not enough administrative cost associated to every grant. And so we've increased it. We increased it first to 15%. And I think in this year, we're increasing it to 25%, particularly because of this moment of inflation and the burden that it places on our organizations. And it's an attempt to try to get around the starvation cycle of these kind of project grants that are very complicated to apply for and very time consuming, and then don't have sufficient administrative costs to cover the functioning of the organizations that we want to be successful. So those are 2 things, and I know they're putting information in the chats. I'd be happy to make sure that any donors who wanted to learn about those programs, we could have a webinar. So that's that. Now about disinformation, misinformation. There's 2 things that I think we need to think about. The first one is the fact that technology is threading through everything. And so oftentimes people think we need to add technology or tech capacity, but that it's siloed from everything else that we're doing. And frankly, the technology is threading through. And so as Fernando talked about, we need interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary tech lenses on everything, which means we need technologists who understand the data, that understand the consequences, that understand the impacts in community with very, very different backgrounds. And we need people confident with these different kinds of tech skills to be able to be in the conversations with our most important grantees. And we need to resource them to have those conversations. So we can't just give a technology organization a grant to, ensure that our grantees are more secure in a surveilled environment. That's not sufficient. We actually need to be increasing the capacity of new types of organizations that wake up every day with a public interest perspective or a civil society perspective or human rights perspective, and they use their technical expertise to demonstrate specific harms, to understand the data, to recommend to regulatory authorities the kinds of responses that would actually have teeth, that would actually stop the bad action that is coming through an unregulated form of technology. And then we also need to take our most important grantees, the ones that we see as central to our strategies, and we have to make sure that they have tech capacity within their organizations as well. And that may mean we need to help them recruit and hire and place technologists. The Ford Foundation has done that through a number of different investments in all different kinds of fellows programs, where we've put technologists into Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, all of these kinds of historic human rights and civil rights organizations. And we've put them actually also in congressional offices so that they can actually understand how to regulate technology. And we've also brought them into the Ford Foundation. So now every single program area in the US office in New York has a tech fellow that sits with the program staff to help them see the way that the tech landscape is going to undermine or advance the kinds of program goals that program officers are funding. We're also finding that Ford is beginning to hire technologists as program officers. We have 3 of them on staff right now, with the understanding that this is an equally important lens to have among our staff to understand sort of the blind spots that we've been operating under. So, so that's the second point. We can't think of, we have a technology problem in a void. We have to think about how technology is touching everything, and we have to invest in the technical capacity of our core grantees and in new institutions that wake up every day and use technology. And I want to be really clear, this isn't about tech solutionism. There will not be an app that solves this problem. There will not be a website that solves this problem. There will not be a blockchain that will solve this problem. What we actually need is civic-minded technologists sitting and thinking about downstream harms and trying to prevent them, and thinking about strategies and approaches to be more successful. So that's the second bucket. And there's a bunch of information there. We have Tech Fellows programs. We can talk to you about them. Mozilla helps us run them. They're an amazing partner. And if it's something you're interested in exploring, we'd love to talk to you about what we learned and make sure that that is made available to anybody who's curious about it. The final thing is we actually have to invest in the leadership of the Global South. And I've been really lucky at Ford because Ford has 10 offices around the world, and really opinionated, smart, brilliant collaborators in those offices who know a lot about what's happening in the ground in the regions where they grant make. And so Alberto Serra da Silva, who's on this call as well, has been able to collaborate with funder partners in those regions to invest heavily in the kinds of organizations that I was talking about before. So organizations that wake up and use technology every day to solve problems for the civil society, and organizations that help translate and work on the kinds of rules that would protect the public in this internet environment. Alberto has funded all sorts of individual organizations, but he's managed to invest in 3 coalitions, like one that's in East and West Africa, one that is in Mexico, and one that is in Brazil. So this is like a coalition of groups that have different skills, some more technical, some more policy, some more organizing, but where they can actually together craft solutions for these incredibly complex problems. I know some of the donors on this call are actually funding some of those groups, and that's great. And if anyone wants to know about those collaborations, again, we're really happy to show you, introduce you to the organizations and let you learn about the important work that they're doing. Because as was said in the last presentation, we have a lot to learn from the strategies in the Global South. The United States was shocked when misinformation influenced our elections, 2 election cycles ago. But the exact same tactics that were used to misinform the public in our election cycle were being used in the Ukraine, just 6 years earlier than that. If we were looking around the world, we'd actually have a better viewpoint of how to do this work. And with that, I think that's all of the main points that I wanted to make. Again, there's no need to start from scratch. Oh, one last thing is some people have been talking about the importance of a convening where funders can continue to do this work. And what I would say is a couple things. There are a number of these convenings that are already happening. There's something called NetGain that is a more US focused collaboration of donors. There is a convening that's being organized in April in France by Ariadne and a couple of other donors that, I don't know if they've got it open for other donors, but it's a place to get started. I think misinformation is just a symptom of our lack of understanding of the technical changes we see in the world. Surveillance is another big problem. Access, censorship, all of these big problems are all rooted in the same transformed environment and we need to actually have the tech lens to be able to approach it. I would say one last thing, if there is going to be a convening, there might be a value in an additional convening of these donors if they want to continue to learn together. And I found it's very, very helpful, particularly if you get the leadership of the foundations to collaborate. Because right now what I find is most often program officers do know they need to make these changes in incorporating different kinds of grantees into their portfolio, but they don't always get permission from the directors and from the leadership. And until the leadership of the foundations understand how big this change is and understand exactly how it works, you find that you only get these incremental changes. That means that there's these persistent blind spots within foundations about the tech transformation of the world that we're living in. So I think that's everything, Lisa, that you wanted me to say. And thanks again for including me. And if anybody has other questions, you can always reach out, because we love to collaborate and we love to share the knowledge of our partners and our grantees and our peers.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I'm actually going to pick it up from here. We've hit up against our scheduled time, so I'm just going to round it off in the last couple of minutes. But I want to say a big thank you to all of our speakers. I think you've really illuminated some of those upstream game-changing strategies that are not obvious to the naked eye, but that are really potent and high leverage. And also you've really demonstrated the interconnectedness of these issues and the importance of looking at new structures, new ways of doing things, and also at the level of mindsets and capabilities. So I think that was a super rich series, and you all kept very well within your scheduled time. So you really concentrated those nuggets of insight for us, and I really appreciate you all joining and preparing to be with us today. So just in terms of where to from here, this is obviously a journey. It's much bigger than those of us in the room here. It's a work in progress. There are many conversations that have been sparked out of the convening series, several collaborative opportunities that have been identified. We've developed a deck or a document that we're calling a strategic resource, which if you haven't received already, you will receive if you register to this webinar. It's essentially sort of guiding through the type of the thinking that we went through in the convening series, and then some strategic questions for people to reflect on who are working in this space. We'll also send out a follow-up email to this event, and if there are any Q&As, any questions that weren't answered, we'll include those in the follow-up email as well. And we just want to leave you then with two questions to think about as we move out of this conversation. How high leverage is your strategy if you're working in this space, and is it game-changing? And where do you need to collaborate more or to better enable collaboration? Finally, just if you would like to follow up on any of these conversations, please contact Lisa. We'll make sure her email is also in the follow-up message. Her email is rudnick@reospartners.com. Big thank you to Oak and CIFF for instigating this, to the team at Reos Partners, to all the participant speakers, and of course to everyone who joined today. So thank you very much, and we'll be in touch soon.